Thank you everyone for joining today to talk about Project Room's entry into the LA streetlight competition, Superbloom. The idea is to use this time to talk about the design proposal and also to talk about the city's process in organizing the competition. We thought that it might be a good way to begin by Christopher talking about the process of organizing the competition, the reasons for doing so, and some of the decisions along the way.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jeffrey. Really a pleasure to be here and happy to be able to talk about this process because it's been fascinating and we're really thrilled from the city's point of view with the outcome. So we were working with our Bureau of Street Lighting, which is a standalone city department. I think it's important to start there. Unlike some cities, we have our own Bureau of Street Lighting with a history that goes back to the 1920s, so nearly 100 years. And also important to keep in mind that the history of really innovative streetlight design goes back in Los Angeles, even further than that. This is a city that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was known as one that was very forward-looking in terms of its streetlight design. So we have a really rich legacy to draw on. So we were working with our Bureau of Street Lighting and Norma Isahakian, who's the now retired executive director of that bureau, as part of my work as chief design officer for the city, thinking about the standard streetlight and the need for an update of that streetlight pole. So just for a little bit of context and a few numbers, we have 223,000 streetlights in the city of Los Angeles. The vast majority of those are the so-called standard poles. So we have really remarkable historical designs all over the city, but the typical pole had become really utilitarian and stripped down to its kind of most basic form by the 1960s. And we were discussing with BSL the opportunity to update it, and we thought that it was might be a particularly good vehicle for a competition for a couple of reasons. One is that I've been focused in a lot of my work since joining the city a couple of years ago in the question of design equity and how we can distribute good design, beautiful design, more equitable across the city. And we certainly, as I mentioned, have this great history of beautiful streetlight design, but like many things like shade, like other forms of sustainable and good design and beauty, we have not typically distributed the most ambitious streetlight design to all parts of the city. And in fact, the most beautiful designs, as with the shadiest neighborhoods, tend to be in our wealthier parts of the city. So we thought it was one way to really address this question of design equity. And also in terms of designed objects in the public right-of-way, there are very, very few objects that touch as much of the city, as many different corners of the city as the standard streetlight. So we thought, again, for all those reasons, it might be a really good vehicle for a design competition. And we organized that in close collaboration with the Bureau of Street Lighting. We brought together a jury. We were in close touch with our Department of Cultural Affairs, which oversees the design of everything that goes out into the right-of-way, and also our Board of Public Works, and really launched what turned out to be an anonymous international competition called LA Lights the Way. The mayor, Eric Garcetti, launched that at LACMA Urban Light last year, and we put out an open call around the world, and we had more than 110 teams end up registering for the competition, which is far more than we expected. And so as a jury, we had our work cut out for us. And to zoom through all of that process, we were really, really thrilled to find out, once the kind of veil of anonymity was lifted, that the winning design came from Project Room, came from an LA-based office. And in a way, we probably shouldn't have been surprised, because one of the things that really allowed it to stand out for the jury was the extent to which it really seemed to represent a kind of LA sensibility. And I hope we can talk about the ways in which it does that. That was one of the challenges that we set out for the competitors, was really to think about technology, think about the role of the LED, think about, again, this question of equity, but also represent kind of sense of LA-ness, if you will. And I think alone among the 4 finalists in the competition, Superbloom really did that.
One of the things that is so striking about the Superbloom presentation is the quote, "Like LA, Superbloom has no single or fixed form." And what seems so great about that is that it fulfills the ambition of the competition, LA Lights the Way, which suggests that LA is a place of design vision, that it creates a sensibility for the city that is so much like the city. And what I mean by that is that despite LA being maybe or clearly by far the most media documented city through advertising and film and TV, LA has no single image. It's continually evolving in its identity and the kinds of images that portray it. And maybe that's one of its most important attributes, that it's evolutionary, that it's always undergoing change, and that is much of the creativity of the culture of LA. If the Project Room team could talk a little bit about this idea that LA, like LA, the project has no single or fixed form. I mean, what it seems to me to suggest is that the design, knowing LA, was meant for the light fixture to take its form in any given context. But by doing that, it allows LA to re-image itself in all its different neighborhoods and contexts.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of the variety, I think that I mean, of course, in the beginning, it came from the kind of the functions that the city was looking for, and there was a list of things that they had identified as needs, that the light should be able to support. And of course, we also added some of our own proposals in terms of what functions we saw as potential. This ended up with a kind of a kit of parts in a certain sense, and then once you have a kind of kit of parts, the combinations and the possibilities of those kind of engender like almost an infinite variety of combinations of possible assembly arrangements. So and with this kind of bouquet, it really became about seeing these as different kinds of arrangements. So certain streets or certain would have certain arrangements, and they could even change light pole to light pole. And this is something that we thought like was really exciting about the design in a certain sense, because like there would be this kind of, I mean, it has a kind of a DNA, but then it also kind of isn't like repetitive or monotonous. It's not a kind of a singular form that kind of obsessively goes throughout the city, and it can respond to a kind of a residential street as it can to a major artery. And of course, we saw this as of course, a great benefit to the city, a great kind of, and also that it echoes the city itself. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I could add to it, it's also just sort of, I can remember growing up here, and we lived at the end of the 2 freeway, and my parents were like Korean immigrants, and they always, every weekend, we would drive to Koreatown, and it was like cutting this massive section through Los Angeles, and you can go from like the suburban sort of foothill areas, and then all of a sudden there's a split in the 2 freeway where the mountain sort of opens up, and you can see the view of the downtown area, and right before that you can see like even, I want to say, the Atwater, Los Feliz area, and then even before that you can see, like, you can just see the wide different ranges of neighborhoods and backgrounds that essentially this light would be a part of. And so thinking about, as Jakob was saying, like an obsessively sort of uniformity that would kind of engulf the city, it didn't seem right. So thinking about this light that could change according to the needs of each neighborhood, it would be sort of familiar in a way, but at the same time, just by looking at the different appendages, you'd be able to tell exactly what neighborhood you were in because it would fulfill the needs of that neighborhood. So that was pretty cool.
I mean, like other cities that see itself as leaders in design, one question is what makes LA different than say Barcelona, which has always promoted very leading edge design, or London, where it's demonstrated that technologically advanced future vision civic amenities could coexist with history. And I think the competition brings up the question of, what are the sensibilities of LA today? And one of the things that was striking about what Christopher mentioned was the idea that that this is design driven, but that access and equity were also really important. I mean, one can think about post-war LA architecture as being so closely identified with case study and experimentation with a single-family home. Maybe the 70s and 80s with experimental architecture of a generation of Frank Gehry and Tom Main and Eric Moss. And then, that in the last 20 years, we've seen, for lack of a better word, best-in-class architects doing amazing civic projects in the city. But that what is so remarkable in the videos and in the representations of Superbloom is that it's a very different LA. It's an LA that cuts across different neighborhoods. It's an LA that is about the cultures of specific neighborhoods. And in that way, it seems like it talks about a focus and attention and care to design as quality of life. Quality of life meaning the quality of work and leisure, and that that Superbloom, in the way that you presented it, talks about the daily life in neighborhoods of where people would walk their dog, in work areas, commercial areas where people have businesses, where things are bought and sold. Is that, and it seems so integral to the way that you presented it as well as to the design. If Project Room, if you can talk a bit about, if any of this makes sense in terms of a contextualization and shift, or was it more your own team sensibility? How do you see this contributing to an ongoing discussion about design in LA?
Well, if I could just quickly, the examples you gave of these sort of like previous eras in LA design. I mean, the thing that I think about here is, like, that's this history of authors, right? And I think one of the things that the flexibility of Superbloom does is it sort of like diminishes that the sort of imposition of authorship on the city. And of course, and going back to your question earlier about LA, the way that this reflects an LA sensibility, LA itself as a whole, doesn't have a sense of authorship in that way. But I think that by doing that, you eliminate or you at least work against the thing that we're, I think, increasingly dealing with these days, is like these sort of like unintended consequences of a top-down approach to culture, to the sort of civic life. So if we can, if the project can look, it's just a streetlight, but if it can reflect a vision a civic space that is that is really responsive to needs. I mean, because it's a kit of parts. If a neighborhood, has strong feelings about one or another attachment, there's the ability to change it, right? It doesn't have to be a fixed form, even in any individual location. So I think we really wanted to understand the limits of our own authorship on this as well, right? That it's going to live next to people's houses, and they'll be able to sort of see themselves in it, hopefully, instead of seeing like Bus or Mayor Garcetti or something.
I think also it was pretty, it's not that it was intentional. I actually didn't even realize, probably should have, but we're all living in these neighborhoods that we really love. It's sort of like the eastern parts, let's say, of Los Angeles, like in El Sereno and Highland Park, like all of these places. Of course, they're getting gentrified, but we like to try to preserve as much of the neighborhood qualities of these places as possible. And so I don't know if it was like purposely that we were trying to, let's say, we just knew that we needed to test the light in so many different places, and we thought, why not test it in our own home, in our own home neighborhoods? And maybe they're the less photographed or lesser known areas of Los Angeles, but if we could work in those areas, then it would probably work in like the areas that also just look really beautiful naturally anyway. Not to say that our neighborhoods aren't beautiful, they are. Yeah, I think there was something kind of more internal to us about trying to appreciate the things that are around us, and getting the light to work within those settings.
Right. I think we also worked with a broad spectrum of context, from Hollywood films to the residential neighborhood to the kind of classic, and that's what's unique, of course, about the competition being about a streetlight, and the whole idea of working with streetlights in the sense that they're, a kind of ubiquitous element, and in a certain that kind of demands that you kind of look at it in a ubiquitous way, that it is this, you have to look at it in all these different contexts, as Sandy mentioned. So that's definitely something that we were very, very concerned with, and also what we needed to see it in all the different kind of places where it would potentially be, So that was and I think also one thing, going back to the idea of equity and the kind of the idea of Los Angeles, something that really excited us about in the brief itself was this return to like this addition of the pedestrian light, which brings both a kind of because I think all of us are actually maybe not, we walk a lot in the city, I think all of us are actually walk unusually a lot for being, the kind of stereotype of LA is that everybody's in their car, but there's actually a lot of people walking and using the streets, and that kind of that demand, or that ask in the brief is, I think, really, really exciting element to really, I think it's something that once these lights start to go in and there's a pedestrian illumination, I think that it will be a huge transformation of those areas that are lucky enough to get this light, because I think now I really do believe that it's going to transform and make the city quite incredible in certain areas, and it's going to radically improve the quality of life. And that's, I think, a really important element. And also what I also love, of course, we love the kind of the classic lanterns of LA, which are actually at that level, so in a certain sense, now we have these high street lights with the current demands and for illumination on the street, but it's somehow really nice to get back to that like lower light element and to and to focus on the pedestrian experience as well, because I actually think it's a little bit neglected, but it is actually kind of a vibrant part of a lot of areas of LA. So
yeah,
I think that's something really exciting.
I think that's a really important thing to mention, actually, is that, you know, I feel like Los Angeles is having this moment where it's becoming more self-aware. And one of the things that we were asked to do as part of the brief, and then as Joachim and Sandy had kind of talked about also, is that we added to that as well this kind of degree of scale that you don't see with the normal pedestrian fixture, or sorry, with the normal streetlight now. The pedestrian fixture is one of those components, and I think there's also the bench and the cultural plaque, and that really speak to that much more a human scale, and that helps integrate the streetlight into the civic space in a way that we don't see now. I think the sunshade was another component to that, talks about, you know, trying to make the street much more comfortable. And so they're speaking not just to like the vehicular network that the current streetlights do. You speak to the pedestrian network with the pedestrian luminaire, but then you also speak now to like the engagement of a person at an individual scale, which is, I think the combination of that is kind of, to me, speaks to the concept of how LA is trying to think about what it is now and what it wants to become, right? It's thinking about all of these different contexts within this one component now of urban infrastructure. So I think that's also something that was important for us as we were kind of thinking about the design too.
Yeah, I mean, like if you think about the history or the past in LA, design has always been geography specific. You know, you can think of really nice houses that were designed in the hills or by the beach, or a civic space that isn't an important part of Los Angeles, but it's a place that you have to travel to get to design. And what seems really brilliant about the competition is that this first competition in a long time, or at least the first competition that has gotten so much exposure in a long time in LA, is not about going to a specific place. It's about a decentralized, distributed design element. And as Project Room has said, you know, that it goes from the streetlight as having its design priority on being high to accommodate car traffic and visibility from the car, to being something that gives visibility, presence, and comfort to pedestrians, is this great kind of rethinking of public infrastructure. Christopher, what do you think are the kind of findings or ideas now in reflection, now that the competition is over, that you think would be important to prioritize in future competitions that LA organizes?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. I wanted to say a couple more things about the design too, and sort of what allowed it to stand out along the lines of what others have been saying. I think what really was unusual about this, not just in the context of the competition entries, but really in recent civic design that we've been looking at, is this really close connection between what we might think of as the metaphors, the pragmatics, and this connection to place of the design. And those are all working very much in concert with one another in a way that I think is really unusual and I think deserves to be underscored a little bit. And what I mean by that is that this idea of the bouquet, obviously, and the color, this particular shade of green that Project Room chose, obviously suggests a certain kind of organic, you know, a certain organic set of metaphors, but that is entirely in service of what we have to ask the light to do in this incredible diversity of sort of programmatic and ever-changing set of programmatic needs that depends on the site and the location. And, you know, many of these lights will just be the kind of standard illumination of the roadway, but then we want to add, in certain locations, we want to add this pedestrian arm, we want to think about adding shade or a bench, and we want to be able to use this cultural plaque to connect to neighborhood history or references to nearby architectural landmarks, etc. So we are asking quite a bit of the poll, and that was one of the major themes of the competition brief. But this idea of the bouquet means that whenever an element is added, the design, and this really was unique among the competition entries, project room design, if you add another element, it seems to become more like itself. It seems to strengthen its basic qualities and metaphors and gestures. And again, that comes from the strength of this basic metaphor, which drives the project. So a lot of the other designs in their basic form for illuminating the roadway, they were very elegant and streamlined. And maybe they were aiming more for kind of seriality, thinking about how a single streamlined element that's very minimal in its form and gestures, as it's repeated down a boulevard, can you know, and illuminated in that repetition, can create this kind of seriality that can be quite effective. And there was something very striking about that approach. And I think a couple of the finalists really pursued that set of ideas. But when you asked some of those more streamlined designs to add elements like a pedestrian arm or other elements, it really seemed to take the design out of itself, if that makes sense. And whereas Superbloom really, again, the more things you asked it to do, it just kind of added another stalk or branch or piece of this plant. It kind of can grow another arm, if you will, and again, it just sort of reinforced its basic sensibility. And that, again, is connected in turn to this idea of the multiplicity of Los Angeles, and again, makes it more at home in whatever location you choose to put it in. And so to be operating across all of those levels was really unusual. And I think, you know, we breathed a sigh of relief as a jury, I have to say, because, you know, we did set a pretty high bar in terms of what we were asking the teams to think about: new technology, new programmatic needs, things like 5G, but also really wanting to represent Los Angeles. And I think it was that close connection, again, between the sort of metaphor and the pragmatics that really allowed it to succeed. So having said that, I think the lessons for future competitions are, one, that I think we continue to be very thoughtful and sparing in which projects a competition makes sense for, and in which projects it's better to pursue another strategy. It's interesting, if I'm being very frank, the kind of anonymity, I think we would have had the second phase not be anonymous. I think going forward, I think anonymity in the first phase is super important, and then once you pick finalists, I think going forward we might lift that veil of anonymity a little bit earlier. We had some advantages in terms of, because again, we're not just choosing a design, we're choosing a team to work with. And so if you don't know who the team is, we figured out ways without broaching the anonymity to kind of ask questions about who the team was and get a sense of kind of what the level of experience and expertise, breadth of expertise was. We're also really helped by the fact that as part of what we tried to make quite a rigorous technical review in the second phase, once we had narrowed the field to 4, we brought in Guy Nordenson, the structural engineer from New York, who's worked with a lot of leading architects, and to me is sort of the leading figure nationally in helping really ambitious designs work from a structural, practical point of view with clients who have that kind of focus, as of course any city department does. So we were able to bring in Guy and his team to work with all 4 of the finalists, and so he could be a sort of proxy also. He operated as a kind of proxy for us to report back, just not on the structural approach of each team, but also sort of the makeup and how collaborative they might be. And he had great things to say about what turned out to be Project Room. It was very helpful, for example, given I think the kind of creativity and inventiveness of the design, for all of us on the jury to hear from Guy that from his point of view, this was the most straightforward proposal from a structural point of view. That was really important to reinforce, to be, you know, with the Bureau of Street Lighting, that we weren't delivering something that was exotic in terms of how it needed to be built. And so it did help to have him as a kind of intermediary. But I would think about the precise sort of use of anonymity when that gets lifted. That's one thing that we've been thinking and talking about.
Can you speak a little bit about some of the things that Project Room mentioned that for them as a sensibility, that they were interested in the character of their design taking a life of its own, that it for them it was less about being an authored work of design, but something that would take on the character of its neighborhood or its constituencies. And in the context of design in LA, you know, whose most recent, you know, as a city, our most recent great design has been civic works by well-known architects who are known around the world. And do you see the role of civic competitions being one where it adds dimension to design conversations and the culture of design by saying, hey, you know, LA could have this amazing creative design innovation, but it's something that doesn't need to reside in high design per se, that it's something that could be much more distributed, or do you think that was more a specific function of the program? I mean, you know, like, do you see it as something that expands, or is it something that was program specific?
No, absolutely expands. And this is striking this balance between taking advantage of the scale of the city and distributing design, again, more equitably across the whole scale of the city is really what makes my job so fascinating, is being able to think about this overwhelmingly large city and striking a balance between that and design that has a particular kind of character and sensibility. And I think, again, this design does this really nicely. It has the same kind of flexibility in terms of its relationship to history. So it looks back to those older designs without seeming trapped in a kind of nostalgia for them. It seems very contemporary and fresh at the same time. And we on the jury really appreciated that balance. But I think this question of authorship is really important. And so I think about my own office, although I'm very, very rarely there these days, but my office is up on the 13th floor of City Hall. And so I look out toward Bunker Hill and I can see some of those kinds of landmarks that you're talking about. I can see Disney Hall, I can see the Broad, I can, you know, from another part of the building, I can see Caltrans. And you're right, you know, we're moving into a generation after that group of stars, essentially. And Bunker Hill, Grand Avenue is one of the, you know, sort of murderer's row of that idea of a kind of celebrity architecture approach to building civic fabric, right? So you have, going back to MoCA, going back to the Music Center before that, but then you have MoCA, you have Disney Hall, you have the High School of the Arts by Wolf Pricks and called Himmelblau, you have the Cathedral by Moneo at the end of that stretch. But I think about the difference between that approach and City Hall itself, which, although, you know, we think about the Parkinsons and the architects who are connected, doesn't have that connection to authorship, certainly not a connection to what we think of now as celebrity architecture, right? And the way that we built public works in that period, City Hall's from the late 20s, the period of really rich streetlight design also, teens and 20s was sort of the high point. That the early part of the 20th century was also when we were building those great bridges over the LA River, although, you know, and students of LA history will know Merrill Butler's name, the city engineer who was responsible for really spearheading a lot of that work. But so City Hall itself, as opposed to like a Disney Hall, which is so connected to authorship, is really interesting. And I do think, you know, you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this moment in LA design history, and the big challenge is taking the kind of innovation and experimentation, which has been largely in the private realm. So you mentioned case studies, so much of that is connected to the single family house, as you mentioned, residential architecture. And pulling it into the public realm and into civic projects. And we had one version of that in the 90s and 2000s, right? With Disney Hall competition, with Caltrans, with, you know, the Broad most recently. And I think as we turn that attention to kind of civic works, the public realm, the public right-of-way, which has been such a focus and will continue to be such a focus of my work, you obviously need a different relationship to the question of authorship, and you need more flexibility. You need something, again, which can respond to community diversity. And the ability, for example, for, you know, when we roll out these streetlights and we have the ability to have a plaque or some space for text, which Project Room has designed quite nicely, I think, quite smartly. We could have, again, something that's citywide. We could have poems by the poet laureate, city poet laureate on that, or famous text about the city of Los Angeles writ large. But we could also ask communities across the city, or council districts, council offices, what kinds of references, again, to community history or specific locations they would like to embed in a poll. And so then you have a very clear combination of this thing which is designed and distributed and overseen citywide by Bureau of Street Lighting, which again is responsible for more than 200,000 of these things across the city, but also some very specific references to community history, or in the case of a bench or shade structure or something else, a response to a very specific community need. And so it was exciting for us from the beginning to think about something in the public realm, public right of way that could do all of those things. And I think it flows absolutely from a new attitude about authorship, as Project Room has already said really nicely.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
I think one thing I just want to say that I mean, I totally agree. I think that I mean, one thing about going beyond authorship is also this idea of, you know, in the end, these kind of projects are, I mean, all kind of civic, even architecture projects are never the work of one person, you know, and the idea that now with this in the kind of new environment, it's more of, it's maybe still about authorship, but more about the including of multiple authors, like that. This project will involve, has involved us. Without the city doing the competition, it would never have happened. And now it's going to go to another phase where the Bureau of Street Lighting is responsible for taking this to fruition. It's going to require the participation and the support of the citizens of the city. That they have to, you know, they are going to be involved in deciding if this actually gets alive. So of course there is this, I think there's just an acknowledgement or an inclusion of a larger context of the people that as a kind of a collective create something together.
And also, yeah, that's a great point. And I should add that this idea of, you know, Disney Hall being a Frank Gehry building that was a myth already. So even this critique of, you know, this moment that we're coming out of had significant limitations even as it understood itself. So yeah, I think that's really important to keep in mind. It's always a myth that one person does it.
In the medieval times, there were no authors. You know, people did things for the spirit of you know. Then it was more a religious experience to create something. It wasn't about you as an individual, but it was more this idea that there was really no authors at that point. You know, so
yeah. So and Jeffrey,
to get back to.
I'm sorry, Joachim. I was just going to say quickly, we've really tried to focus on less on authorship as a category per se, and more thinking about how the city can be a more progressive client or even patron of good design, and just thinking about us as a force for enabling more voices to kind of be in the conversation, particularly younger firms, and always looking for ways to introduce a younger, more diverse group of firms to that city process. I think is really where we've tried to put our focus.
Yeah, it's really a testament to Project Room. They're a young firm. They don't specialize in street light design or urban infrastructure, and the fact that they could win an international competition and demonstrate that they can create a design that meets very specific technical requirements is a testament to our design community in LA. That it's filled with talented designers that can meet the challenges of a very specific call. Like, you know, and it makes me wonder, you know, what are things Project Room would you like to undertake? And this idea that you know, for designers, it's no longer that one has to start with house additions and move to single family homes and so on and so forth, that it shows that that large municipalities recognize design and wish to promote it. Are there things that that you have ambitions that you'd like to fulfill that are civic related?
I don't know if we thought of it that way. I know that, like, when Isaac had started Project Room, it was, you know, his background is as a contemporary artist, and I think there's an approach in terms of the firm itself. It's more of a collaborative platform, and that's what actually makes it really different. Is you know, no project is too out of the realm of a particular niche of the firm. It's just that if you can kind of bring the people together under this umbrella, you know, if you look at the history of some of the projects, like he's, I don't know, of course, Isaac can tell you more, but I just, you know, the thing I love, there's this project called Tickles that he's done that really shows like the collaborative effort of like many people coming together with no author involved in, but the crazy thing is that when you walk into that space, it was like a bar sort of created by artists. And it also housed, I believe it was like the clown painting collection of, oh, I don't even remember his name. John C. Reilly, the actor. And it was like a really bizarre program brief, but at the same time, when you walked in, there was like literally like a guy playing the piano who also plays the music for the video. It really created this intense vibe and environment. And I think that's kind of the strength of this firm, just because we're really intent on creating those environments, even if it is with the street light or even if it's with like an art piece. It doesn't, there's no limits, right? And so when you're allowed to like kind of get out of the realm of like, let's say, house additions and renovations, I think it's an important practice for many people to sort of flex this entirely different part of their brain, because I think that sort of creativity will circle back and feed into the renovations and things, and that's how like all those designs will just progressively get more and more interesting and better for the city. So yeah, I don't know if we necessarily laid out our let's say genres of work, but I do know that we are more in the conceptual and more about this idea and more about an ethos that really hits back to creating an environment that really touches people. And yeah, I don't know if that's an answer, but
I would just add one other thing, which is that something about, excuse me, something about about a collaborative framework like that does allow, I think it expands what any individual person, you know, it limits what's the best way to say this? It removes the obstacles to your ambition, right? That like, as an individual, you know, you want to do this thing which is beyond your scope, but if you can put a team together, you can take that on, right? So you know, there are things that I want to do, there are things that Sumit or Joachim or Sandy want to do individually. You know, maybe we can get there, maybe we can't, but together with other people. That Tickles project was, I worked with Michael Dopp, a painter, and then it from that point we absorbed so many different people's work, and yeah, I mean, there's so many places, there's so many areas. If your ambition can be completely released, you know, I want to make a cemetery now. It'll take years, but I see no reason why I can't do that, right? Like, that's something I can do, as long as we put the people together, and that's just one example, right? So yeah.
Joachim or Sumit,
I would love to do a public pool or a bath, you know, a public pool. I think to do something like that, especially for Los Angeles. I mean, there are some, but there can always be more.
I mean, I think for me, I would echo a lot of what's been said. I agree with a lot with what Sandy was actually saying too, that, you know, throughout my career, the different projects that I've worked on, it's less about the actual genre or type. I mean, yeah, I have probably more experience in some areas than others, but I think it's about being able to take on the different challenges that come with working on different projects and understanding. I mean, for me, I guess scale is probably the most interesting thing across all of this, and thinking about the ways that different projects address different scales, and then that kind of then brings together kind of thread for thinking about, how someone lives in a space to how someone lives in a public space, right? I think those kinds of different conditions have probably a lot in common, as well as they do have a lot of differences. And I think investigating and thinking of ways to push design, push the spaces that we make to do something a little bit different, I think every time is probably more of the ambition, more of the goal than kind of trying to hook into a particular project type. So,
like when we think conventionally of architects doing things that affect cities, we think of master planning. City planners, urban planners, and architects working to think about how to re-image the use, the density, the layout of a large area, whether it's a urban mixed use or residential area that would involve roads, new building construction, landscape, etc. And if that's one way that an image of the city can be produced, what seems so evident in this competition and with Superbloom is that the designers can have an effect on the vision of the city by its elements rather than through large scale developments. And repetition and variation of an element could just as much, if not more, have an influence in the way that we see the city. Maybe if both Project Room and Christopher can talk about that, the strategy of thinking about elements repeated as a way to shape Los Angeles and what you think of as opportunities there.
I think Los Angeles in general, I think that the streetlight itself is very a kind of a unique opportunity in a certain way, because it's one of the only elements that is repeated in the city. And I'm also kind of, I think in general, I think Los Angeles, there's a kind of a repetitive fabric to the city, but at the same time, I would be very wary of any kind of repetitive a design move or intervention that kind of lays itself across the city in any other sense. I think even the streetlight itself, even now, we're not expecting this light to be ubiquitous. This is going to be gradually introduced as needed in certain neighborhoods where it's desperately needed, where old lights are damaged or need to be replaced as it's needed. It's not going to be, it's not entering into a kind of a blank slate situation at all. So that's something that I've always liked about Los Angeles. It's kind of partially its character is this kind of chaotic strangeness that seems a little bit out of control. I have to say that I lived in Los Angeles over 10 years, and I think I had a kind of maybe a naive or blue-eyed idea that Los Angeles was without, it was like a kind of Wild West of like that you could create anything at all. But actually, that's one thing I do believe like is a little bit problematic, or something that kind of I find a little bit depressing, is this level of bureaucracy, the level of like really heavy and sometimes quite absurd building code and building regulation. That I think actually makes a lot of things impossible. And these kind of invisible, like I find urban plans are not at all, like urban visions, like are not as interesting as real intervention into the building code, because that's actually like what would really transform the city. And I think something that probably Christopher is really, of course, really aware of. And how to deal with all the, like, this today's society is also, a lot more complicated. There's many more interests involved. How to really engage with, like, truly in Los Angeles would be to kind of it would be kind of to address, like to really revolutionize. I'm not saying that we can ever go back to, you know, kind of like total freedom in terms of what you can build. But I do see there's a lot, like there's a lot there, and that's, I think, the most fruitful avenue for Los Angeles, is to really look at that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the you know, if there's an idea that you know, whether it's true or not, that the myth of LA was that at a certain point, architects could basically do anything they want to do. That Superbloom suggests that given a number of constraints and requirements, that that something creative could be produced. I mean, it seems like what you're saying is that say, instead of doing a really creative design for a single family house or whatever the project might be, that an architect could look at the codes that dictate multi-unit residential or ADUs or whatever it might be, and that within those very specific constraints that are relatively new to the city, that one could come up with just as creative as an idea that yielded Superbloom.
Yeah, we're definitely. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. It's Project Room. Was there something you want to add to that?
Oh, I mean, I think I think, I mean, because I know I'm not going to. Christopher definitely has something to say about the ADU side. I know they're involved with some project on that level. I hear what you. I think that's almost what they're doing. I would add a little bit. Like, I think almost that would be interesting to. For me, I've always been interested into not to kind of to have a kind of a deep dive into the current parameters and what's possible, but actually what is impossible within the current parameter. Because there's a kind of this, and that's what's invisible, like all the projects that, or all the kind of potential that is excluded because of these regulation, and to make that invisible visible, I think would be a very interesting, you know, like kind of critique, but also like maybe as a competition also to, or like a kind of an investigation into really to propose, like to do concrete proposal for changes. And to do that as a kind of a public, public project to gain support, because I do think that there's like, it is just invisible to most people, because those buildings don't get built, or those potentials never get realized. So I find that very interesting, this kind of invisible city. That I mean, there's also like old projects that, you know, existing buildings or the case study houses, many of those would be illegal to build in the current realm, right? So that's another kind of interesting aspect to the current regime.
Christopher, would you like to?
So I'm thinking about a couple of points that were just made. So Jeffrey, what you were saying about urban visions and where they come from in Los Angeles. So I've certainly given that a lot of thought and thinking about how some of the most productive examples of that could be brought within the city. They have tended to exist or be generated outside of the city. So two really emblematic examples are the 1929 plan for parks and open spaces across LA County that the Olmsted brothers and Harlan Bartholomew did. That was commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce, which at that point was arguably as powerful as the city council. But that document is something that I look back to all the time. It was sort of recovered from the dustbin of history by Bill Deverell and Greg Tice, two historians here. And what's astonishing about that document, it was so progressive that it scared the Chamber of Commerce a little bit. It called, for example, for limiting development along the LA River so that the river could move within it. This is before channelization, of course. It could move in its kind of seasonal patterns, and it recognized that there would have to be wetlands or open space that could flood. What what now seems like a cutting edge idea. This was in 1929. It had, but it was really remarkable for the quality of its design vision, but also the quality of its writing and the breadth of what it was proposing. So it had sample legislation in the back. It had sort of sample bond measures to figure out how to fund all these things. Again, the ambition was such that the Chamber of Commerce got a bit scared about how progressive it was and sort of put it on a shelf. And then the Depression came along and sort of killed it for good. So that's one example, again, generated outside of City Hall proper. And then, you know, we've heard about the case study program a few times. That's, you know, generated by a magazine, generated by a magazine editor in particular, John Intenza. And I think that Joachim is right that there are visions contained in those documents that either we never built or would not be legal to build today. But I think it's also important to remember the kinds of limitations of those projects in their particularly their racial politics. So the case study program really relied on, first of all, was not interested in critiquing the ways in which it relied on federal subsidy, freeway construction, home ownership subsidy, and the ways in which that subsidy was really, really exclusive and was available almost exclusively to white home buyers, for example. But the question of how you bring those kinds of projects within City Hall and try to be much more open-minded about the biases and sort of things that you're relying on is something that we've been thinking about a lot. I'm glad that he mentioned swimming pools, because I've been thinking about how to support a culture of innovation in city work, particularly among young architects, and broaden the work that's already happening in the city. And so one way we think we might be able to do that is having a kind of a new on-call list for smaller scale projects that the city builds, which could include things like rec centers or parks, small scale things like a swimming pool. I remember going to Medellin in my old job when I was the architecture critic for the LA Times about 10 years ago now, and really being struck by the number of young firms that were doing city projects, schools, and there's a really, really powerful pools project by a young landscape firm. And Luis Callegas, who's now at Harvard, was, I remember touring me around that. That was done out of a competition for the South American Games that were going to be held in Medellin. And so there was this whole ecosystem of supporting library branches, schools, parks, rec centers that were coming through competition. And young firms expected that they would be competitive. And there were ways of putting incentives in for local firms to do well, so they wouldn't get sort of big-footed by big international, big multinational firms. So looking at all those things as examples, and thinking about how the other thing you mentioned in terms of kind of standardization and the opportunities there, I think trying to think about where, for example, housing production is happening and where we can be supportive again of a culture of young firms. So we are beginning to develop a standard plan, which is a sort of design pre-approval process for ADUs, which will be an interesting test of some of the themes that you were raising about whether within the really significant constraints of ADU construction, which have everything to do with, not just setback requirements and state law, but, DWP requirements and connections to sewer and power and those kinds of things, not to mention neighborhood constraints, hillside, all those other things that make it difficult to build housing in Los Angeles. And so we're using that standard plan process as a way to test whether through the very standardization and potential repetition, not so different from the streetlight to a certain extent, thinking about volume and scale and whether those things might be vehicles for carrying some design innovation into more corners of the city, and not just relying on the private clients who have really traditionally been the drivers. If you think about the single family house and kind of experimentation in LA architecture, that relied entirely on land being affordable and available, and a sort of group of clients being ready to take a chance on younger architects. And certainly case study would not have been possible without that sort of set of conditions, and those conditions are over. They've been over for a long time. And so we need to think about how, again, we can put some vehicles in place to, in effect, think of the city as a kind of supporter or even a patron of that kind of architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I would just what I totally agree, and I mean I only use the case study house as one example. I don't see us going back to that, and I don't really have any nostalgia for it. I actually see it as more, there are actually more constraints in terms of modes of living and modes of ownership and modes of financing in the current code that kind of experimentation in terms of like a mix of living situations are excluded, you know, that could be more complex, more mixed, and also, you know, like even with like the small lots that you cannot build, even though they're very, very regimented and they result in a very uniform expression, right? And so, and that's a kind of contemporary example of like codes which are, you know, incredibly like kind of constrained, but also, yeah, like they really exclude so much possibility, and that's, I think, maybe more a contemporary critique.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, I think it's interesting that when we think about the opportunities of promoting young architects in LA, that that open space is one of the most valuable commodities and building materials. That, you know, that there isn't a need for architects to think about, say, the construction of tall buildings or other things that are usually associated with you know, the technical expertise of a large firm. That what you can make of open space goes such a long way in LA. And you know, we think about the skyscraper or office tower as a model for the work environment, or the single family home as the model of residential. Those are, you know, clearly things of the past. And the idea that LA could be the place where a new model of work could be formed around exterior space, or a model for multi-unit housing that's formed around outdoor space, is so clearly already in formation. But because they both are predicated on outdoor space, maybe it is an opportunity for young firms to get involved in, be it on the scale of an ADU or mixed use development. We're at an hour. Just to kind of wrap up, I mean, you know, one thinks about, this is a question. Now, when one thinks about image making in LA and how movies and TV shows and advertisements have constructed the image of Los Angeles, and that many of the B-roll shots, if you will, are urban streetscapes, and to think that in the future, Superbloom would be part of those streetscapes, and maybe even be the inspiration for specific kinds of content for films and videos, different than maybe the Hollywood blockbuster, or the Hollywood blockbuster, but also other kinds, is such an exciting thing. And I think that the way that you've communicated the project is a success in illustrating all of the potentials of the project. And clearly, as Christopher said, that's something that really resonated with the jury. Maybe if just as a way to kind of end, if there are thoughts both Project Room and Christopher have on what you see as image making that would be constructive in thinking about urban life in Los Angeles. You know, what are examples of that, or what are aspirations that you have along those lines?
I don't know. I just wanted to say, because it just made me, you know, this idea that the light would be in the background. I think, you know, a lot of the time, this having something that's identifiably LA is often not wanted in the movies, and probably they want to edit it out in post, you know. So maybe that's why we made it green, so it's easy for them to take it out, you know, if they want to make the city some other location. You know?
I think if you imagine the light also with like a soft focus in the background, the sort of the structure of the light, which is made of these tubes, will read as like fluting, or it could read as fluting in a back. Like I think that this like can disguise itself in the same way that like, you know, a residential, like a neighborhood of craftsmen in Pasadena, you know, pretends to be Ohio. I think this can still pretend to be, you know, another place.
But I liked, you know, of course, I know you're speaking to a specific image in the presentation that we're working on right now. But, you know, when you think about Los Angeles, of course, all the movies come up, right? Like all of them. And, you know, I'm specifically thinking actually about, let's say like La La Land, or even Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I kept noticing like the older streetlight, and I'm coming to realize that even Hollywood, when it's making sort of the image of Los Angeles, they're definitely just sort of carting in the light and putting it on set or on site to like, because when you drive past those same locations, you're like, where is that light that they were dancing around? And it's not there. So yeah, and I think one of the other things is that you know, I just have like a penchant for the show Insecure by Issa Rae and her team, and it's so wonderful because it's really showing like a much more deeper side and complex side that I think, like, of course we want to look like we're just like Hollywood stars living in the hills, but maybe not. Like there are these complex stories and these beautiful stories coming out of every neighborhood. And so right now, sort of the things that are happening in terms of the image making of Los Angeles in general is also going through rapid change. And I almost found like I had too much too many sources, and it's like, wow, this is great. Like there's a dearth of it versus like, you know, even 10 years ago, I'd been working on a competition somewhere here. It was actually really hard to come by. So yeah, I think it's this evolution and this change is super, and I'm glad I've had many things to Photoshop our light into.
I think this it's such an interesting question, this tension between a certain understanding of LA design culture as kind of freewheeling and innovative in a way that we've talked about. And again, it's important to recognize the limits of that culture and who was allowed, who had access to that freewheeling, sort of what we think of as LA school architecture, largely white men doing buildings for white men. But that certainly is in the mind as this idea of a kind of freewheeling, anything goes ad hoc culture, right? And then contrasting that with the generic quality of the streetscape that has been so valuable for Hollywood, not just for feature films, but also if you think about car commercials, you know, many of which are filmed in the parts of downtown that don't look recognizably downtown. So they would never include Disney Hall or Caltrans. They would be in the historic core. They would be along Spring Street or Main Street, for example. And that Hollywood and the kind of entertainment industrial complex is banking on a set of cityscapes that are not recognizable, that can stand in for Chicago or Seattle or even a European or Asian city, and that there's an interesting there is an interesting tension between that and our interest in fixing designs that are more connected to community. And there's an infamous story about LA DOT putting in a bike lane of a particular shade of green along Spring Street, where a lot of those a lot of commercials are filmed, again taking advantage of that sort of generic backdrop, and it being a particular shade of green that was tough to scrub out in post. So we'll have to see how this shade of green operates, and of course, you know, it's such an integral part, an important part of our economy. We have to be thinking about that, but at the same time, we have to be insisting on design elements that are grounded in communities and insisting that it's important set of values to support that connection to place, and really question the ways in which Hollywood has banked on a kind of generic cityscape, and maybe the possibilities that has foreclosed in the public right of way, and the way it is, again, kind of kept architectural innovation trapped behind, you know, the hedges of sizable single family pieces of land. So that's, you know, that's all of that stuff is sort of captured in the response that Project Room put together for this competition, and one of the ways that it really, you know, was such a rich proposal.
Fantastic.
Another, just a small addendum to the whole thing is that, I mean, it's a small aspect to the whole thing, but we actually use software that's not generally used for architecture. It's actually a software that Hollywood uses more for VFX and the kind of blockbuster movies in order to generate the light, and this whole aspect of kind of using Hollywood software it's a kind of a small point where like it's not really visible in the design itself, but it has certain aspect or certain possibilities that kind of traditional, you know, design or CAD software doesn't have, you know. So it's actually kind of like funny that we use the Hollywood tools to make the light itself.
I think it's totally visible in the light, though, right? That it has that it's so iterative, right? That the light that making it a family, the sort of infinite family, you know, that's the kind of thing that when you need like a crowd of 100,000 orcs attacking the castle, that's how you use it, right? You make 100,000 individual orcs, and so, you know.
It's all about like creating also, you know, that the director wants, you know, 30 different versions of something, and that's really what one of the really powerful elements of this thing. So that it's really like kind of, yeah, to kind of use the Hollywood tools for this thing was really kind of an eye-opener. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for your time and for the conversation, and thank you very much, LA Design Festival, for the platform to share this really great project and ideas.